The first time I noticed something different about Daniel was at my father's annual summer barbecue, 3 weeks after I'd returned from my freshman year at college. I was 19 then, still unsure of my place in the world, caught between the person I had been in high school and whoever I was becoming. Daniel had always been there, hovering at the edges of my childhood, my father's best friend since their college days, the man who taught me how to cast a fishing line, and who always remembered my birthday when even my father sometimes forgot. But that day, as I watched him laughing across the yard, beer bottle dangling casually from his fingers, something subtle had shifted. It wasn't him who had changed. It was me. I remember the exact moment. The way the evening light caught in his dark hair, threading silver at the temples, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He looked up, caught me watching, and something passed between us, brief, electric, impossible. Then Dad clapped him on the shoulder, and the moment dissolved into nothing. I turned away, heart hammering against my ribs, suddenly afraid of what I might have accidentally revealed in my gaze. This was Daniel, my father's best friend, 42 years old, married once and divorced, a fixture in my life since before I could remember. Whatever I thought I'd seen was just a trick of the light, the disorientation of coming home to find everything both achingly familiar and strangely different. I avoided him after that, making sure we were never alone. When he asked about my classes, my future plans, I gave short answers and found reasons to be elsewhere. If he noticed my sudden awkwardness, he didn't mention it, but sometimes I'd look up to find him watching me with an expression I couldn't decipher, thoughtful, curious, as if he were seeing me for the first time. I told myself I was imagining things, that the strange, persistent ache in my chest whenever he was near was nothing more than confusion, the natural disorientation of returning home and finding myself caught between identities. I had spent the past year at college cautiously exploring who I might be, away from my father's expectations in the small town where everyone had known me since birth. Now, home for the summer, I felt like I was wearing a mask, playing a role I had outgrown. Dad mentioned one evening that Daniel had offered to help me find a summer internship at the architectural firm where he worked. "He says you've got a good eye," Dad said, proud but puzzled, as if unsure how to categorize this particular talent. Architecture had been my quiet passion since childhood, though I'd never seriously considered it as a career until recently, mostly because it felt too impractical, too much like dreaming. The next day, Daniel called. His voice on the phone was casual, friendly, betraying nothing unusual. "Your dad says you're interested in architecture. I've got some connections. Why don't you come by the office tomorrow? I can show you around, introduce you to some people." I agreed before I could think of a reason not to. The firm occupied the top 2 floors of a renovated industrial building downtown, all exposed brick and steel beams and massive windows overlooking the river. Daniel met me in the lobby, dressed differently than I was used to seeing him, charcoal suit, blue tie loosened at the collar, hair slightly disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it. Professional, but with an untamed edge that made him stand out among the sleek, polished people moving through the space. "There he is," he said, and something in his smile made my stomach drop. He led me through the office, introducing me to colleagues whose names immediately slipped from my memory. I was too aware of his hand occasionally brushing my shoulder, the way he stood slightly closer than necessary when showing me a set of blueprints. "You've got a good instinct," he said later, as we stood looking at a model of the firm's latest project, a community arts center on the city's west side. We were alone in the conference room, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, dust motes dancing in the golden light. "You see things others miss." I wasn't sure if he was talking about architecture anymore. He was standing close enough that I could smell his cologne, something woodsy and subtle, could see the fine lines around his eyes, the shadow of stubble along his jaw. I had spent years looking at Daniel without really seeing him. Now I couldn't stop seeing him, and it terrified me. "Thanks for doing this," I said, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. "But I should probably go. Dad's expecting me home for dinner." Daniel didn't move. "Your father tells me you're different since you came back from college. Quieter. He's worried about you." The statement hung in the air between us, a question disguised as an observation. I stared at the architectural model, focusing on the tiny trees, the miniature people frozen in their everyday lives, wishing I could shrink myself down and disappear among them. "I'm fine," I said finally. "Just figuring things out." Daniel nodded, his eyes never leaving my face. "It's a hard age," he said softly. "Too old to be a child, too young to feel settled in your own skin." I remember. Something in his tone made me look up, and the expression on his face knocked the breath from my lungs. Understanding, yes, but something else too. Something that mirrored the confused tangle of emotions I'd been carrying since that moment at the barbecue. The internship began the following week. 3 days a week, I would take the bus downtown and spend hours at the firm, learning the software, observing meetings, occasionally offering hesitant suggestions that, to my surprise, people actually considered. Daniel was busy with his own projects, but he always made time to check on me, to offer guidance or encouragement. We developed a routine: lunch in the small park across from the building, sitting on a bench with takeout containers, talking about buildings and design, and occasionally, cautiously, more personal things. He told me about his divorce, about the house he was renovating himself, about his college dreams that had both succeeded and failed in unexpected ways. I told him about my classes, my roommate, the professor who had first suggested architecture might be more than just a hobby for me. We never acknowledged the current that ran beneath our conversations, the way our eyes would sometimes meet and hold for a beat too long, the careful distance we maintained even as something invisible pulled us toward each other. It was nothing, I told myself. Imagination and loneliness and the simple human need to be truly seen. Besides, Daniel had never given any concrete indication that his interest in me was anything other than friendly mentorship, a favor to my father, perhaps mixed with genuine professional encouragement. If sometimes his gaze lingered, if sometimes our fingers brushed when he handed me a coffee or pointed to something on a drawing, it meant nothing, couldn't mean anything. The day everything changed was ordinary in every way until it wasn't. A Tuesday in late July, hot and sticky, the kind of summer day that seems to stretch endlessly. I had been at the firm since morning, working on a small project Daniel had entrusted to me. Preliminary sketches for a riverside gazebo, part of a larger development but mine to design with his guidance. I was bent over my desk, frustrated with a perspective that wouldn't quite work, when his voice came from the doorway. "Still here, it's almost 7. I looked up, startled to find the office nearly empty, the sky outside the windows deepening toward dusk. Daniel leaned against the door frame, jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up to expose tanned forearms, his tie hanging loose. I lost track of time, I admitted, suddenly aware of my rumpled shirt, the pencil I'd forgotten behind my ear, the hours I'd spent hunched over the drawing. Daniel smiled, that crooked half-smile that always made something twist in my chest. "Happens to the best of us, the curse of loving what you do." He crossed to my desk, looking down at the scattered sketches. "These are good, really good." His shoulder brushed mine as he leaned closer, and I fought the urge to either lean into the contact or pull away. "But you're overthinking it. Here." He picked up a pencil, his hand moving confidently across the paper, making a few quick strokes that somehow transformed my frustrated tangle into something elegant and obvious. His face was inches from mine, his breath warm against my cheek. I could see the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw, a small scar near his eyebrow I'd never noticed before. "There," he said, his voice low. "Sometimes you need to step back. See the whole picture." He turned his head slightly, and suddenly we were looking directly at each other, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the slight chap on his lower lip. Time seemed to stop, stretch, compress. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't look away. Then Daniel straightened, clearing his throat, putting distance between us. "You should go home," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Your dad will wonder where you are." I nodded, gathering my things with clumsy hands, hyper-aware of his presence still hovering near my desk. At the door, I paused, looking back. Daniel stood where I'd left him, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable in the dimming light. "Thank you," I said, "for everything." The words felt inadequate, laden with meanings I couldn't express. Daniel's smile was tired, a little sad. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We still have a lot of work to do on that gazebo." But something in his tone suggested he wasn't talking about architecture at all. I left, the weight of unspoken things pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe in the humid summer air. That night, I couldn't sleep, replaying the moment over and over. The nearness of him, the look in his eyes, the words he hadn't said. I told myself I was reading too much into it, that the strange tension between us existed only in my imagination. Daniel was kind and brilliant and generous with his time and knowledge. If I had developed feelings that went beyond admiration and friendship, that was my problem to solve, not his to bear. The next week passed in a blur of work and careful, polite interactions. Daniel was professional, friendly, but something had changed. A guardedness that hadn't been there before. A deliberate distance he maintained. I mirrored his behavior, focusing on the gazebo design, asking technical questions only, ignoring the hollow ache in my chest. We still had lunch in the park, but now other interns or colleagues often joined us, the conversations safely impersonal. If anyone noticed the change, they didn't mention it. Only once did the facade crack, a moment when I was explaining my latest revision, gesturing a bit too enthusiastically and sending my portfolio falling to the floor, papers scattering. As we both bent to gather them, our hands touched over the same sketch. Daniel froze, his fingers warm against mine, and when I looked up, his expression was naked, unguarded, longing and conflict, and something deeper I was afraid to name. Then the moment passed, masks back in place. The careful choreography of our new, distant relationship resumed. By Friday, I had convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. The connection between us, the unspoken current, the look in his eyes in that unguarded moment. Daniel was my father's best friend, a successful architect who had generously taken me under his wing. Whatever I thought I'd seen was just projection, the confused emotions of a 19-year-old still trying to understand himself, let alone anyone else. I resolved to be professional, to learn what I could from him, to get over this inappropriate infatuation. On Saturday morning, my phone rang. Daniel's name on the screen made my heart stutter, my finger hovering over the answer button for 2 rings before I finally accepted the call. "Hey," he said, his voice different somehow. Rougher, less composed than I was used to hearing. "Are you busy today?" I wasn't. I was at a golf tournament, the house empty and quiet, the day stretching ahead with nothing to fill it. "I'm working on the house," Daniel continued when I told him this. "Could use an extra pair of hands, if you're interested. And I thought we might talk about your gazebo design. I had some ideas last night." It was a perfectly reasonable request. Daniel had mentioned his renovation project several times, and the gazebo was, after all, my assignment at the firm. Still, something in his tone made my pulse quicken. "Sure," I said, trying to sound casual. "Text me the address. I can be there in an hour." His house was on the outskirts of town, an old craftsman set back from the road, surrounded by oak trees and overgrown gardens. The renovation was clearly ongoing, new windows contrasting with weathered siding, a half-finished porch, scaffolding along one wall. Daniel met me at the door, dressed in worn jeans and a faded t-shirt, a smudge of paint on his forearm. He looked different here in his own space, more relaxed and less the polished professional I was used to seeing at the firm. "Thanks for coming," he said, leading me through rooms in various stages of transformation. Stripped floors waiting for refinishing, walls partially painted, spaces where the bones of the house were still visible, waiting to be covered. It's a slow process when you're doing it mostly alone, but I like getting my hands dirty. Sitting at a desk all day, designing spaces for other people, sometimes I need to remember what it feels like to actually build something. We spent the morning replacing rotted boards on the back deck, working in companionable silence punctuated by occasional instructions or questions. It was easier like this, focused on a physical task, the previous tension between us eased by the simple rhythm of work. By noon, we were both sweaty and tired, and Daniel suggested a break. "Beer?" he offered, then smiled at my expression. "Right. Forgot you're not quite there yet. I've got lemonade, water, iced tea." We settled in the shade of a massive oak tree, glasses of iced tea dripping condensation, the summer heat pressing around us. "You're good at this," Daniel said after a while. "Working with your hands, not everyone who can design can actually build." I shrugged, oddly pleased by the compliment. "My mom used to say I was good at fixing things," I said, the words coming before I could think better of them. "Before she left." Daniel's eyes softened. He knew about my mother, of course, her departure when I was 12, the sporadic phone calls and birthday cards that gradually dwindled to nothing. Dad rarely spoke of her, the wound still raw even after all these years. She was right, Daniel said simply. You see how things fit together, how they could be better. There was that feeling again that he was talking about something more than deck boards or building designs. I looked away across the overgrown yard to where wildflowers nodded in the slight breeze. I brought my sketchbook, I said, changing the subject, if you still want to talk about the gazebo. Inside, the house was cooler, ceiling fans stirring the air, the renovation chaos less evident. Daniel spread my drawings on the dining table, a beautiful antique piece that seemed at odds with the unfinished state of the room around it. This was my grandmother's, he said, noticing my admiration. One of the few things I kept after the divorce. He stood close beside me, pointing out aspects of my design, suggesting modifications, his voice shifting into the familiar cadence of professional critique. But underneath ran that current again, awareness of his proximity, the casual brush of his arm against mine, the way his voice sometimes dropped lower when making a particularly important point. I forced myself to focus on the drawings, on the technical aspects of what he was saying, ignoring the warmth that spread through me whenever he leaned closer. You have real talent, he said finally, straightening up, putting a few inches of careful space between us. Not just technical skill, plenty of people have that, but you have vision. You see possibilities others don't. I felt myself flush at the praise, unused to such direct approbation. It's just a gazebo, I mumbled, embarrassed. Daniel shook his head. It's never just a building, he said. It's a space for human experience, for life to happen. He was looking at me with that expression again, the one I'd been trying to convince myself I'd imagined. Intense, searching, as if he was trying to see beneath my surface to something hidden, even from myself. I looked away, heart pounding, afraid of what he might see if I met his gaze too long. I should probably go, I said, though there was nowhere I needed to be, no one expecting me. Daniel nodded, but made no move toward the door. Instead, he crossed to a cabinet in the corner, returning with a bottle and 2 glasses. Scotch, he said, pouring a small amount in each. My one real indulgence. He held out a glass to me. I won't tell your father if you don't. I hesitated, then took it, our fingers brushing in the exchange. The moment stretched, teetered on the edge of something I couldn't name. Daniel raised his glass slightly. To seeing possibilities, he said softly. I took a sip, the liquor burning a path down my throat, warming me from the inside out. Daniel watched me over the rim of his glass, his eyes dark and unreadable. Why did you really ask me here today? The question escaped before I could stop it, hanging in the air between us. Daniel set his glass down carefully as if the next movement might shatter something irreplaceable. Because I wanted to see you, he said finally, each word deliberate, weighted. Outside the office, away from your father's shadow. I wanted to see if what I've been feeling is real or just... He trailed off, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration I'd come to recognize. This is inappropriate. You're 19. You're Tom's son. I've known you since you were in primary school, for God's sake. He moved away, creating distance between us, his back to me, as he stared out the window at the overgrown garden. I stood frozen, the glass cold in my suddenly numb fingers, the world tilting beneath my feet. What have you been feeling? My voice sounded strange even to my own ears, young and uncertain and hopeful all at once. Daniel turned slowly, his expression a complex mix of emotions I couldn't fully decipher. Conflict, resignation, a softness that made my chest ache. Something I shouldn't be, he said quietly. Something that could hurt a lot of people, you included. He took a step toward me, then stopped himself, hands shoved into his pockets as if to keep them contained. I've spent the past month telling myself I'm imagining things, that I'm just lonely, or having some kind of midlife crisis, that what I think I see when you look at me is just projection or wishful thinking. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure he must hear it, the blood rushing in my ears nearly drowning out his words. And what do you think you see? I asked, barely above a whisper. Daniel closed his eyes briefly as if in pain. Something that mirrors what I'm feeling, he said finally, meeting my gaze. Something that terrifies me because if I'm right, I should walk away right now. And if I'm wrong, I've already said too much. The silence stretched between us, taut with possibility and danger. I set my glass down carefully, afraid my trembling hands might betray me. You're not wrong, I said, the words barely audible but irrevocable once spoken. Something shifted in Daniel's expression. Relief, fear, and beneath it all, a cautious joy that made my breath catch. I've spent weeks telling myself I was imagining it, I continued, the words tumbling out now that the dam had broken. That it was just admiration or some kind of hero worship. That someone like you would never. I trailed off, suddenly uncertain again, acutely aware of my youth, my inexperience, the vast gulf of years and life between us. Daniel took a step toward me, then another, until he was close enough that I could see the faint stubble along his jaw, smell the subtle cologne that had become so familiar. I've never felt this way about another man, he said quietly. About anyone, really, not even when I was married. It scares the hell out of me. Not just because of who you are, though God knows that's complicated enough, but because of how overwhelming it is. His hand rose, hesitated, then gently brushed a strand of hair from my forehead, the touch so light it might have been imagined. I don't know what to do with this, he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. I'm 23 years older than you. I'm your father's best friend. You're just starting your life and I'm. He shook his head, a sad smile touching his lips. I'm at a very different place in mine. I wanted to argue, to tell him age didn't matter, that nothing mattered except the connection between us. But even in my inexperience, I knew it wasn't that simple. What do you want to do? I asked instead, hardly daring to breathe. Daniel's eyes held mine searching, deep with an emotion I was afraid to name. I want to try something new, he said finally, his voice so low I had to lean closer to hear him. Something I've never allowed myself to want before. He cupped my face gently, his palm warm against my cheek, and for a moment I thought he might kiss me. Instead, he spoke again, the words stopping my heart. I want you to run, as far and as fast as you can from me. From this, before we do something that can't be undone. Before I ruin your life and destroy the only friendship that's kept me sane for 20 years. He stepped back, creating distance between us again. His expression hardened into resolve. You should go, now, and we should forget this conversation ever happened. But I couldn't move, frozen by the contradiction between his words and the naked longing in his eyes. Is that really what you want? I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. Daniel's laugh was bitter, humorless. What I want doesn't matter. I'm trying to do the right thing here. I took a step toward him, erasing the distance he'd created. What if the right thing isn't always the expected thing? I asked quietly. What if sometimes the right thing is the thing that feels impossible but true? Something shifted in Daniel's expression, hope warring with fear, desire with restraint. He opened his mouth to respond, but was cut off by the sudden jarring ring of his phone. He glanced at the screen, his face draining of color. It's your father, he said, and the bottom dropped out of my world. Time suspended as Daniel stared at his ringing phone, my father's name glowing accusingly on the screen. The sound seemed to fill the entire house, insistent, demanding, a sharp intrusion into the fragile moment we'd created. Daniel's eyes met mine, conflicted and suddenly guarded. I took an instinctive step back as if my father might somehow see through the phone, might somehow know what had just passed between us. The third ring cut through the silence and Daniel answered, his voice remarkably steady, betraying nothing of the conversation that had preceded the call. Tom, hey, a pause as he listened, his eyes never leaving my face. No, I haven't seen him today. Was I supposed to? Another pause, longer this time. I understand. If I hear from him, I'll let you know. Oh. When he hung up, the silence between us felt different, heavier, laden with new complications. He's looking for you, Daniel said finally, running a hand through his hair. Apparently you weren't answering your phone. I pulled my phone from my pocket to find 3 missed calls, all from my father. I'd silenced it before arriving, not wanting interruptions. A simple action with consequences I hadn't anticipated. What did he want? My voice sounded strange even to my own ears, thin, uncertain. Daniel sighed, the weight of our reality settling visibly onto his shoulders. He finished his golf tournament early, wanted to know if you'd like to join us for dinner tonight. He's invited me over. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. My father, unwittingly drawing together the very people trying to decide if they should stay apart. "You should call him back," Daniel said softly, moving toward the kitchen, creating distance between us. "Tell him you were busy, phone on silent, that you'll be home soon." He was giving me an out, I realized, a way to step back from the precipice we'd approached, to pretend none of this had happened. Part of me wanted to take it, to retreat to the safety of what I knew, what was expected. The familiar patterns of my life before this summer, before Daniel had become something more than my father's friend, more than a mentor. But a stronger part of me couldn't bear to let go of the truth we'd finally spoken aloud. "And if I don't want to pretend this didn't happen?" I asked, my voice stronger than I expected. "If I can't?" Daniel turned back, his expression conflicted, but softened by something that looked almost like hope. "Then we find a way forward that doesn't destroy everything and everyone around us." He hesitated, then added, "Including you. Especially you." There was such tenderness in his voice that my chest ached with it. "I'm not as fragile as you think," I said, stepping toward him, erasing some of the distance he'd created. "I know what I feel. It's not confusion or hero worship or some phase. Oh, it's real." Daniel's smile was gentle, tinged with sadness. "I believe you," he said quietly, "but that doesn't make this simple." He was right, of course. Nothing about this was simple. My father was waiting at home, expecting us both for dinner, unaware that his son and his best friend were standing in a half-renovated house, hearts exposed, future uncertain. I called my father back, invented a plausible excuse about helping a friend move furniture, my phone accidentally silenced. Agreed to dinner at 7. All the while, Daniel watched me, his expression unreadable, though something in his eyes made my heart race. When I hung up, he said simply, "We should talk about this. Not now, there isn't time. But soon." I nodded, suddenly unsure what to say, how to bridge the gap between what had been and what might be. "I'll see you at dinner," I said finally, heading for the door. At the threshold, I paused, looking back. Daniel stood where I'd left him, hands in his pockets, afternoon light casting half his face in shadow. "This isn't over," I said, half statement, half question. His smile was faint but real. "No," he agreed softly. "It isn't over." Dinner that night was an exercise in controlled tension, at least for Daniel and me. My father, oblivious, filled the silence with stories from his golf tournament, complaints about his coworkers, plans for the upcoming fishing trip he'd been trying to organize for weeks. I picked at my food, hyper-aware of Daniel across the table, the careful way he avoided looking directly at me, the deliberate distance he maintained. Yet there were moments, his hand passing the salt, his quiet laugh at something my father said, when I felt that current between us, stronger now that we'd acknowledged it, impossible to ignore. Once, catching me watching him, his expression softened momentarily, something intimate passing between us before he turned back to my father's conversation. Afterward, as Daniel prepared to leave, my father insisted on showing him the new grill he'd bought, leaving me alone in the kitchen, washing dishes with mechanical precision, mind elsewhere. I didn't hear Daniel return until he spoke, his voice low. "I've made an excuse to leave," he said, and when I turned, he was closer than I expected, just a few feet away, his expression serious. "But I meant what I said. We need to talk properly." He hesitated, then added, "Tomorrow? The old boathouse at Linden Park? 3 o'clock?" I nodded, heart hammering against my ribs. From the backyard, my father called Daniel's name. "I have to go," he said, but didn't move, his eyes holding mine for one electric moment before he turned away. I barely slept that night, thoughts circling endlessly. What Daniel had said, what I had admitted, what might happen next. By morning, I had convinced myself of a dozen different scenarios, each more unlikely than the last. He would tell me it had been a mistake, that we should forget it ever happened. He would suggest we explore whatever this was between us, consequences be damned. He wouldn't show up at all, would avoid me until summer ended and I returned to college, the whole thing fading into an intense but ultimately meaningless memory. The day stretched endlessly, each hour crawling by until finally, at 2:30, I left the house, telling my father I was meeting friends. The lie tasted bitter on my tongue. The first of many, I realized, if Daniel and I pursued whatever this was between us. The boathouse at Linden Park was rarely used these days, the lake mostly abandoned in favor of the newer recreation areas on the other side of town. It stood at the end of a dirt path, partially hidden by willows, weathered woods silvered by years of sun and rain. As a child, I'd sometimes come here to be alone, to escape my father's well-meaning but sometimes overbearing presence, especially in the difficult years after my mother left. Now it felt fitting that this place, so connected to my past, might become the setting for a conversation that could reshape my future. Daniel was already there when I arrived, leaning against the railing of the small deck, looking out over the still water. He turned at the sound of my approach, his expression cautious but warm. "You came?" he said simply, as if he'd half expected I wouldn't. I nodded, suddenly nervous, unsure what to do with my hands, how to stand, what to say. All the practice speeches I'd rehearsed throughout the sleepless night seemed hollow now, inadequate for the complexity of what lay between us. "I wasn't sure you would," I admitted finally. Daniel's smile was faint but genuine. "I considered not coming," he said, his honesty oddly reassuring. "Spent most of the night thinking about what the right thing to do would be." Something in his tone made my heart sink. "And did you decide?" I asked, preparing myself for disappointment, for the gentle letdown I'd half convinced myself was inevitable. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair in that now familiar gesture of internal conflict. "I decided that the right thing and the easy thing aren't always the same," he said finally. "The easy thing would be to walk away. To tell myself that what I'm feeling is inappropriate and impossible, that it would hurt too many people, that the age difference is too great, that your father would never forgive either of us." He took a step toward me, close enough now that I could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the tiny fleck of green in his otherwise brown left iris. "But the right thing is to be honest, with you, with myself." Another step, and now he was close enough that I could smell his cologne, could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool shade of the boathouse. "I've spent my whole life doing what was expected," he continued, his voice low and intent. "Being the person others needed me to be. The dutiful son, the dependable friend, the committed husband, even when the marriage was failing, the professional who never steps out of line." His hand rose, hesitated, then gently touched my cheek, so lightly I might have imagined it. "And then you came home from college, and suddenly I was seeing you. Really seeing you for the first time. Not as Tom's son, not as the kid I taught to fish, but as a person in your own right. Smart, thoughtful, talented. With this way of looking at the world that makes me see things differently too." His hand dropped, but he didn't step away. And I realized I wanted something I'd never allowed myself to want before. My heart was beating so hard I was sure he must hear it, must feel it in the small space between us. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's eyes held mine, searching, vulnerable in a way I'd never seen before. "I want to know you," he said softly. "Not as Tom's son, but as yourself. I want to see where this connection between us leads, even though it terrifies me. I want to stop pretending that what I feel for you is simple mentorship or friendship." He took a deep breath as if gathering courage. "I want to try something I've never had the courage to explore before. With you. If that's what you want to." The world seemed to still around us, the gentle lap of water against the boathouse pilings, the distant call of birds, the rustle of leaves in the slight breeze, all fading to background as I absorbed his words, the enormity of what he was offering. Not just affection or desire, but a willingness to step into uncharted territory, to risk everything for something neither of us fully understood yet. "I want that too," I said finally, surprised by the steadiness in my voice when everything inside me was trembling. "I have for weeks now, maybe longer without realizing it." Daniel's expression softened, relief and joy and lingering apprehension all mingled together. "This won't be easy," he warned, though his eyes never left mine. "We'll have to be careful. Your father—" He trailed off, the unspoken complications hanging between us. "I know," I said simply. The reality of our situation was inescapable. My father, his oldest friend, the town where everyone knew everyone's business, the inevitable judgment if what was between us became public knowledge. "We'll figure it out," I added, with more confidence than I felt. "Day by day." Daniel nodded, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. "Day by day," he agreed softly. Then with deliberate slowness, as if giving me every chance to pull away, he reached for my hand, his fingers warm as they entwined with mine. We stayed like that for a long moment, hands clasped between us, neither speaking, the simple contact saying more than words could. Then Daniel gently tugged me toward the railing, and we stood side by side looking out over the lake, shoulders touching, hands still joined. "Tell me something," he said after a while, his voice thoughtful. "Something you've never told anyone else." It was such an unexpected request that I laughed, the sound breaking the reverent quiet that had settled around us. "Like what?" Daniel shrugged, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Anything. A secret, a dream, something that helps me know you better." I thought for a moment, watching a dragonfly skim across the water's surface, iridescent wings catching the afternoon light. "When my mom left," I said finally, the words coming easier than I expected, "everyone kept telling me it wasn't my fault. Dad, the school counselor, even you, I think." Daniel nodded, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of my hand, encouraging. "But I never believed them," I continued. "I kept thinking there must have been something I could have done differently. Been less trouble, more interesting, something that would have made her want to stay." I'd never admitted this to anyone, had barely acknowledged it to myself, but here, with Daniel, the truth felt safe, even necessary. "It wasn't your fault," Daniel said quietly, echoing those long-ago reassurances, but somehow his words carried a weight the others never had. Perhaps because of the simple way he said it, without pity or platitude. Perhaps because of how well he knew my father, my family situation. Perhaps because I was finally ready to hear it. "I know that now," I said. "Most days, anyway." Daniel's hand tightened slightly around mine, a gentle pressure that felt like understanding. "Your turn," I said, suddenly wanting to shift the focus, to learn something about him that wasn't common knowledge, that wasn't part of the Daniel everyone else knew. He was quiet for so long I wondered if he'd answer at all. Then, still looking out over the water rather than at me, he said, "I've never felt like I belonged anywhere. Not really." It was so unexpected that I turned to study his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows as he continued. "I've always been good at fitting in, at being what people needed me to be. The reliable friend, the promising architect, the husband. But inside there's always been this disconnect, like I'm playing a part in someone else's story." He glanced at me, a rueful smile touching his lips. "Until recently, until you." The simple admission left me breathless, the implication of it, that whatever was happening between us had somehow given him a sense of authenticity he'd been missing, both thrilling and terrifying in its responsibility. "What happens now?" I asked finally, the question that had been hovering unspoken between us since that moment in his house. Daniel turned to face me fully, our clasped hands still between us like a tether. "Now we take it slowly," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "We get to know each other, not as Tom's son and Tom's friend, but as ourselves. We're careful, discreet." His free hand rose to brush a strand of hair from my forehead, the touch achingly tender. "And we're honest with each other, even when it's difficult. I won't make promises I can't keep, and I won't ask you to either. This, whatever it becomes, has to be built on truth." The wisdom in his words steadied me, eased some of the chaotic emotion that had been swirling inside since yesterday. This wasn't some reckless passion or forbidden thrill. It was something deliberate, thoughtful, a conscious choice to explore a connection neither of us had expected but both now acknowledged. "I'd like that," I said simply. Daniel smiled, the expression transforming his face, making him look younger, lighter, as if some burden had been set aside. "Good," he said softly, "because I'm not sure I could walk away now if I tried." There was such vulnerability in the admission that my chest ached with it, with the knowledge that this man who had always seemed so confident, so self-contained, was choosing to show me his uncertainty, his need. The weeks that followed took on a dreamlike quality. Ordinary life continuing on the surface while underneath, everything had changed. I still went to the internship 3 days a week, still had dinner with my father most evenings, still met up with old high school friends occasionally. Daniel still worked on his projects at the firm, still joined my father for their regular Thursday night beers, still renovated his house on weekends. But now, there were moments carved out just for us. Coffee before work in a cafe across town where no one we knew ever went. Texts late at night when neither of us could sleep. Occasional afternoons at his house under the guise of mentorship. The gazebo project, our cover story. We were careful, almost painfully so. In public, we maintained the appropriate distance. Friendly but not too familiar, professional at the firm, casual in my father's presence. Only when we were truly alone did we allow ourselves to bridge the gap, hands touching, shoulders leaning together as we looked at building plans. Once, memorably, his arms around me as I stood before him, back to his chest, both of us looking out at the summer storm that had trapped us at his house, the electricity out, candles casting flickering shadows across the room. We didn't rush, didn't push beyond what felt natural. Each small intimacy a deliberate choice rather than a headlong fall. "Is this enough for you?" Daniel asked one evening as we sat on his back porch, the renovation finally complete enough to use the space, fireflies blinking in the gathering dusk. I knew what he was really asking. Was the careful pace, the limited physical contact, the necessary secrecy enough to sustain whatever was growing between us? I considered the question seriously, aware of the doubt that sometimes flickered in his eyes, the fear that he was somehow holding me back or asking too much. "Yes," I said finally, reaching for his hand across the space between our chairs. "This is enough. You are enough." The relief in his smile told me how much he'd needed to hear it, how the question had been weighing on him. My father, thankfully, remained oblivious to the shift between us. If he noticed that Daniel and I seemed more comfortable together, that we occasionally referred to conversations he hadn't been part of, he attributed it to the internship, to the mentorship he himself had encouraged. "It's good to see you taking an interest in someone's future," he told Daniel one night, as the three of us cleared away dinner dishes. "God knows he listens to you more than he does to me these days." There was no resentment in his tone, only affection and perhaps a hint of wry acceptance that his son was growing up, finding his own path. Daniel and I carefully avoided looking at each other, guilt mingling with a perverse relief that my father's trust remained intact, for now at least. The summer began its inevitable slide toward autumn, the days imperceptibly shorter, the light taking on a golden quality that spoke of endings and beginnings. My departure for sophomore year loomed, a complication we had acknowledged but not fully discussed. One afternoon in late August, Daniel took me to see a building he'd designed early in his career. A small music school on the edge of town, simple but elegant, the sort of project that rarely wins awards but serves its purpose beautifully. "I drive by sometimes when I need to remind myself why I became an architect," he said, as we walked the perimeter, his hands in his pockets, shoulders relaxed in a way they rarely were in public these days. Not for recognition or innovation, but to create spaces where life happens. Inside, the building was cool and quiet. Summer classes ended for the season. The halls empty of the students who would return in a few weeks, just as I would return to my own studies, miles away. Daniel led me through practice rooms and classrooms, pointing out details I might have missed. The way light filtered through carefully placed windows, the acoustic properties of certain walls, the flow of space designed to both connect and separate. In a small courtyard at the center of the building, he finally broached the subject we'd been avoiding. "You leave in 2 weeks," he said. Not a question, but a statement of fact, his voice carefully neutral. "We should talk about what that means. For this. For us." The afternoon sun cast dappled shadows through the single maple tree that dominated the courtyard, its leaves already showing hints of the red they would become in another month. I sat on a stone bench, suddenly needing the support, the solidity beneath me. "I don't want this to end," I said simply, the words inadequate but honest. Daniel nodded, joining me on the bench, close but not touching, mindful even here of potential observers. "Neither do I," he admitted quietly. "But I'm also aware that you're going back to a life I'm not part of. New experiences, new people. I don't want to be something that holds you back or ties you to a place you're trying to grow beyond." The generosity in his concern made my throat tight with emotion. This was what had drawn me to him from the beginning. Not just the physical attraction or the intellectual connection, but this fundamental decency, this willingness to put others' needs before his own. "You don't hold me back," I said, turning to face him fully. "You make me feel more myself, not less." I hesitated, then added, "But I understand what you're saying. College is different. A separate life." Daniel's smile was sad but genuine. "A life you should embrace fully," he said, "without complications or secrets or divided loyalties." For a moment, I feared he was ending things, using my departure as a natural conclusion to whatever had been building between us these past weeks. That doesn't mean we can't find a way forward, he continued, as if reading my thoughts. Just that we need to be realistic. Phone calls, messages, visits when you're home on breaks. His hand found mine on the bench between us, hidden from view by our bodies, the touch grounding me as he added, and freedom, for both of us. Space to live our separate lives while we figure out if what we have is strong enough to bridge the distance. It wasn't what I'd wanted to hear. Some romantic part of me had hoped for promises, for certainty, but I recognized the wisdom in his words, the respect he was showing for both our situations. Okay, I said finally. We try, day by day, just like we said at the beginning. Daniel's relief was palpable, as if he'd expected resistance or disappointment. Thank you, he said softly, for understanding, for being willing to navigate this complexity with me. He glanced around the empty courtyard, then leaned closer, his voice dropping even lower. I've never felt this way before. About anyone. It terrifies me and exhilarates me in equal measure. The admission left me momentarily speechless, the naked vulnerability in his eyes more intimate than any physical touch we'd shared. Me too, I managed finally, the words simple but heartfelt. Daniel smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that transformed his face, made him look younger, freer. The last 2 weeks of summer passed in a bittersweet blur, final days at the internship, goodbye dinners with high school friends I'd barely seen, preparations for the return to campus. Daniel and I stole moments where we could. Early morning coffee, late evening walks, one precious afternoon at his house, ostensibly finalizing my portfolio for architecture applications, but mostly just being together, talking, sharing the parts of ourselves we'd kept hidden from others. There were moments of physical closeness too. His hand on the small of my back as we looked at drawings, my head resting briefly on his shoulder as we sat side by side on his couch. Once, daringly, his lips brushing my forehead as we said goodbye. The gesture so quick I might have imagined it if not for the lingering warmth it left. The night before I left, my father insisted on a special dinner. My favorite foods, wine he normally saved for special occasions, a rare openness about how proud he was, how much he would miss me. Daniel was there, of course, maintaining the careful balance we'd established, friendly, interested, nothing that would raise suspicions. Afterward, as my father busied himself with dessert in the kitchen, Daniel and I found ourselves momentarily alone in the living room. I'll walk out to my car, he said, voice low. 5 minutes later, tell your dad you forgot something at my place. Say you need to pick it up before you leave tomorrow, that you'll be quick. The plan was so unexpected, so unlike his usual caution, that I simply nodded, heart racing at the thought of a few stolen minutes alone. 5 minutes later, I made my excuses to my father, who waved me off with good-natured impatience, focused on serving the perfect portion of his famous apple crumble. Outside, the night was warm, stars obscured by scattered clouds, the air heavy with the promise of late summer rain. Daniel's car was parked down the street, partially hidden by the massive oak that marked the edge of our property. He was waiting beside it, a shadow among shadows, and as I approached, he opened the passenger door, gesturing for me to get in. Once inside, the world narrowed to just the two of us, the interior of the car a private universe separate from the complications waiting outside. I wanted to give you something, Daniel said, reaching into his jacket pocket. Something to take with you. He held out a small box, simple and unadorned. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton, was a silver compass, old but well-maintained, the needle swinging gently before settling on north. It was my grandfather's, Daniel explained, watching as I lifted it carefully from the box. He gave it to me when I left for college, said that even when we're not sure where we're going, it helps to know which way is true north. The metaphor wasn't lost on me, this thing between us, new and uncertain, but somehow pointing towards something real, something true. Daniel, I can't, I began, overwhelmed by the significance of the gift. You can, he said gently. It's not a chain or a promise or an expectation. It's just a reminder that whatever happens, wherever life takes you, there's something honest between us, something worth exploring. He hesitated, then added, and it's something you can explain, if anyone asks. A gift from a mentor. Nothing suspicious. Always practical, always careful, even in this most personal of gestures. I closed my hand around the compass, feeling its weight, its history, the meaning Daniel had infused it with. "Thank you," I said simply, unable to find words adequate for what I was feeling. Daniel smiled, the expression visible even in the dim light of the car's interior. "I'll miss you," he said quietly, the admission clearly difficult for him, a man unused to expressing such vulnerability. "More than I probably should." I nodded, suddenly finding it hard to speak past the tightness in my throat. "I'll miss you too," I managed finally. "But I'll be back for Thanksgiving and winter break." It wasn't enough, a few scattered weeks over the coming months, but it was what we had, what was possible given our circumstances. Daniel nodded, his hand reaching across the space between us to cover mine where it still clutched the compass. "We'll make it work," he said, with more confidence than I felt. "Day by day, remember?" I nodded, forcing a smile despite the ache in my chest at the thought of leaving tomorrow, of the distance that would separate us, the complications that remained unresolved. "Day by day," I agreed softly. For a long moment we sat in silence, hands joined over the compass, the connection between us almost tangible in the quiet intimacy of the car. Then, with gentle deliberation, Daniel leaned across the space between us. I held my breath, uncertain of his intention, heart hammering against my ribs. His free hand rose to cut my cheek, the touch light but sure, and then he pressed his lips to my forehead, lingering this time, the contact no longer brief or deniable, but a conscious, deliberate gesture of affection. When he pulled back, his eyes were dark with emotion, a complex mix of tenderness and restraint. "For the record," he said softly, "this isn't how I imagined saying goodbye." The implication hung between us, that in a different world, without the complications of age and connection and my father's friendship, our parting might have been very different. "I know," I said simply. "Me neither." Daniel's smile was wistful but genuine. "But we have time," he said, "to figure this out, to see where it leads." The promise in his words steadied me, eased some of the ache of impending separation. Whatever was between us wouldn't end with my departure. It would continue to grow, to evolve, to find its own shape in the days and weeks and months ahead. All too soon, it was time to return to the house, to my father waiting with dessert and reminiscences and last-minute advice for the coming school year. Daniel and I got out of the car simultaneously, careful to maintain appropriate distance as we walked back, aware that my father might be watching from a window, that neighbors might notice two figures too close together in the darkness. At the edge of my yard, just before we would become visible from the house, Daniel paused. "Call me when you get there tomorrow," he said, his voice casual enough to sound innocent to any potential observer but his eyes conveying so much more. "Let me know you arrive safely." I nodded, the compass a reassuring weight in my pocket, a tangible reminder of what had been promised, what might still be possible. "I will," I said, matching his tone of casual friendship. Then, taking a risk because I couldn't bear not to, I added softly, "And Daniel, I'm glad you decided to try something new." His smile in response was brief but radiant, transforming his face in the dim glow of the street lamp. "So am I," he said simply. Then, with a final nod, he continued toward the house, shoulders straight, expression composed, once again my father's best friend, my mentor, nothing more. I followed a moment later, the distance between us appropriate, expected, a necessary fiction. But as I watched him greet my father at the door, accept a bowl of dessert with a laugh and a warm comment, I knew that what lay beneath the surface was real, was true as the compass pointing north in my pocket, as true as the heart beating in my chest. Tomorrow I would leave, would return to the life waiting for me at college, would navigate the separation and the silence and the careful, deliberate connection we would maintain across the distance. But tonight, for these last few hours, we occupied the same space, breathed the same air, existed in the same moment. And for now, that was enough. The knowledge that whatever happened next, whatever complexities awaited us, we had found something honest in each other, something worth exploring day by day, step by step. True north guiding us forward into uncharted territory.